So, back in 2019, the Indian city of Patna basically went underwater. And you might think, okay, a natural disaster, but this was something else. This was a catastrophe that was literally decades in the making. So, in this explainer, we're going to dig into a geographical study that asks a pretty startling question. How can a city, in effect, drown itself?
I mean, this all went down over the course of just about a week. The monsoon rains came down hard, and a whole city just ground to a halt, paralyzed. Streets, homes, everything just submerged.
And the scale of this thing was just staggering. At its worst, we're talking about 70 to 80% of all the residential areas in Patna being flooded. Just let that sink in for a second. The huge majority of a major city completely underwater.
Now, it's so easy to just point a finger at the weather, right? Oh, it was the rain. But what this study shows us is that the real story here is so much more complex. Yeah, the rain was the trigger, for sure, but it was far from the only cause. So, what really happened?
Okay, to really get this, we've got to dissect the anatomy of the disaster. Because here's the thing, a disaster isn't just a natural event like an earthquake or a storm. It's what happens when that event smacks right into a community that's exposed and, well, totally unprepared.
All right, let's start with the absolute basics. We all think we know what a flood is, right? But look at this definition. The key phrase for our story here is in a built-up area. That little detail, that's where everything starts to get really complicated. And that leads us straight to this idea of an urban flood. See, this isn't just about a river breaking its banks. This is a flood that's actually made worse by the city itself. We're talking about all the concrete that can't absorb water, drains that are just totally overwhelmed. The city's own design literally becomes a part of the problem.
Okay, now this next term is maybe the single most important one for our whole investigation. It's vulnerability. The IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they define it as the predisposition to be adversely affected. So what does that really mean? It means a storm can blanket an entire city, but it doesn't hurt everyone the same way. Not even close. Vulnerability is the reason why.
Okay, so we've got our key concepts down. Now let's start the actual investigation. Our very first clue isn't in a file or a report. It's in the ground beneath the city itself. We're talking about Patna's physical geography.
Now, I know this map looks a little complicated at first glance, but the main takeaway is actually super simple. Patna is not flat. Not at all. Just look at the colors. The green spots are low, kind of like a bowl, and the red and yellow spots are higher ground. And well, we all know how gravity works, right? Water flows downhill, and it's going to pool right in those bowls.
So what this does is it creates this really stark division in the city's landscape. You've got about 35% of the city that's low-lying land. These are the natural bowls, the depressions. Then you have the high ground, which, no surprise, is where the oldest parts of the city were built. It's just naturally safer from flooding. The lowland, on the other hand, is naturally at risk. Now remember this division, highland versus lowland. It is absolutely critical for what comes next.
All right, let's move on to clue number 2, and you'll see how this story starts to build. We're not talking about natural landscapes anymore. Now we're talking about what people built on top of that landscape, especially over the last few decades. So, after 1990, Patna just explodes with people moving in, a massive influx. The city had to grow, and it had to grow fast. But where do you build? Well, the city expanded into the cheapest, most available land, which just so happened to be those exact same low-lying areas we just looked at. Natural drainage canals? They got paved over. Unplanned settlements started popping up everywhere, basically clogging the city's arteries. And the old drainage system, which was built for a much smaller city, just couldn't handle it. It was completely overwhelmed. And this right here just perfectly illustrates the core of the problem. This quote from the research paper is honestly jaw-dropping. Only 10% of Patna is planned. Think about that. That means the other 90% just grew, organically, chaotically, with no master plan for crucial things like drainage or how to handle a flood. The city was literally building risk right into its own foundations. So let's recap our clues. We have a city with natural low spots, these bowls, and we have decades of completely unplanned growth that funneled people right into those exact dangerous spots. So now, let's see what happened when the heavy rains finally came in 2019. Okay, this slide right here, this is the heart of the entire investigation. Don't get bogged down in the details. Just look at the patterns. On the left, in blue, you see the areas that flooded.
On the right, in red, are the areas where the city's most socioeconomically vulnerable people live. Do you see it? The maps are almost identical. The overlap is, well, it's perfect. And it's terrifying.
It really is a chilling conclusion, isn't it? The flood wasn't random at all. The water flowed exactly where you'd expect it to. It went straight into those low-lying, unplanned areas, which were the very same places the city's most vulnerable people called home. It's like physics and sociology collided, and the results were just devastating.
So who were these people, really? Well, the study gets very specific. We're talking about daily wage workers, people who literally can't afford to miss a single day of work. We're talking about lower-income families, the elderly, children, people who are just physically more susceptible. These were the communities that suffered the most. They were trapped in their homes, facing shortages of food, clean water, medicine, electricity, everything.
Look, the story of Patna is an absolute tragedy. There's no doubt about it. But it's also an incredibly powerful case study, with lessons that reach far, far beyond its city limits.
And the researchers who did this study, they couldn't be clearer about this. They say their findings should be treated as an alarm bell. Because, let's be honest, Patna is not some unique one-off case. All over the globe, cities are growing at a breakneck pace, and a lot of that growth is happening in hazardous areas.
So what are the big takeaways here? What should we remember from this? First, disasters are not just natural. They're a mix of nature and society. Second, how we build our cities matters a lot. Unplanned growth is pretty much a recipe for disaster. Third, and this is so important, social inequality has a physical geography. It puts the most vulnerable people in the direct path of danger. And finally, you just can't fight Mother Nature and win. A city that's built without respecting its own natural landscape is basically a city waiting for a catastrophe to happen.
At the end of the day, what happened in Patna wasn't an accident. It was the result of thousands of choices made over decades of unplanned growth. And it forces all of us to ask a really critical question for our time. As our cities all over the world continue to expand, are we consciously and carefully building resilience, or are we just building the next disaster?